The body had been conveyed to the vestry with all the solemn inefficiency of rural medical practice, and Dr. Ashford, a man more accustomed to treating agricultural accidents and stubborn constipation than sudden death, had pronounced the matter sufficiently mysterious to warrant contacting the local police. This pronouncement had taken the better part of an hour, during which the congregation had dispersed into that peculiar state of coordinated chaos that English villages manage with such practiced ease. Within 2 hours, Inspector Meredith of the Ashford Constabulary had arrived, a capable-looking fellow with the sort of moustache that suggested he had spent considerable time perfecting it at the expense of actual police work. Wimsey, having maintained his position with all the casual persistence of a man waiting for a particularly delayed train, had made himself gently indispensable by noting that he was, in fact, Lord Peter Wimsey, a name that still carried sufficient weight in official circles to ensure that his observations were, if not welcomed, at least tolerated. The inspector had regarded him with a particular mixture of suspicion and deference reserved for titled amateurs who occasionally solved murders and always made inspectors look rather less thorough than they had hoped. They now stood in the vestry, a cold stone chamber that smelled of damp cassocks and the faint corruption that seemed to have accelerated considerably since the vicar's arrival an hour and a half ago. "Poison, surely," Wimsey observed, bending over the corpse with the clinical interest of a man examining a particularly challenging crossword puzzle. The body had stiffened considerably, rigor mortis proceeding at a rate that suggested either significant muscular exertion before death or something rather more chemically accelerated. Notice the discoloration about the lips and that rather distinctive almond aroma. Unless I'm profoundly mistaken, and I rarely am regarding such matters, we're dealing with cyanide. Potassium cyanide, most likely, though hydrocyanic acid remains a possibility. He straightened, producing a cigarette case from his waistcoat with the air of a conjurer who had just successfully produced a rabbit from thin air. Rapid onset, you see. The man was robust enough, no signs of prior cardiac weakness, but cyanide works with rather admirable efficiency. The victim would have experienced collapse within seconds of ingestion. Most unpleasant, though mercifully brief, Inspector Meredith had immediately dispatched a constable to secure the church, posted another at the vestry door, as though the vicar might suddenly resurrect himself and flee, and commenced the business of preliminary interviews in that dogged manner which suggested he was following a manual entitled "What to Do When Important People Die in Your Parish." He had begun with Miss Blackwood, the formidable elder sister, who had seated herself upon a wooden chair with the rigid posture of a woman accustomed to discomfort and determined to endure it with pointed stoicism. She wore black already, which seemed either prescient or merely consistent with her general appearance. The Reverend had seemed quite well this morning, she stated, her voice possessing the texture of sandpaper applied to granite. He consumed his usual breakfast, porridge, 2 kippers, toast with marmalade. Margaret prepared it herself as always. He then dressed in his vestments and proceeded to the church at 10:30. There was nothing unusual in his manner or demeanor. "And the sermon?" Wimsey interjected smoothly, ignoring the inspector's rather pointed glance suggesting that amateur interference, however well titled, remained interference. "I noticed the Reverend seemed to become somewhat agitated just before his collapse. Did he seem troubled yesterday? Or perhaps earlier this week?" Miss Blackwood's eyes, those anthracite chips, narrowed with something approximating consideration. The Reverend had received a letter on Thursday, from London. He became rather withdrawn after reading it. He did not discuss its contents with the family, which was his custom. He merely retired to his study and requested that he not be disturbed. She paused, then added with the sort of precision that suggested she had been observing her brother with considerably more attention than she had previously admitted. He appeared to be frightened, though not the sort of fear one experiences from external threat, rather the sort of fear one experiences when confronted with one's own conscience. This observation hung in the cold vestry air, with the weight of a genuine clue, though whether it pointed toward murder or merely toward the peculiar psychology of guilt-ridden clerics remained, for the moment, obscure. Inspector Meredith had begun making notes in a small leather journal, his moustache quivering slightly with the effort of concentration. The constable at the door shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with both the corpse and the social awkwardness of standing in close proximity to death. Wimsey, meanwhile, had walked toward the small vestry table upon which lay the Reverend's personal effects, his prayer book, his fountain pen, and a small envelope, currently sealed, bearing the postmark of St. Pancras, London, dated Thursday last. The letter itself was conspicuously absent. He held up the envelope, catching the light through its thin paper. "Inspector," he observed with studied casualness, "I note that the envelope is present but the letter itself has vanished. Curious, is it not, how people commonly remove only the MOS? T. Incriminating evidence. Far more logical simply to burn the entire affair, but then logic and panic rarely maintain comfortable acquaintance. I suspect we shall need to examine not only what the Reverend received, but also with whom he had been corresponding. A letter from London, posted Thursday, suggesting the possibility of considerable prior relationship. The sort of relationship, perhaps, that required discussion in a pulpit sermon regarding matters of payment." Inspector Meredith's moustache had achieved an impressive degree of agitation by this point, quivering with the particular distress of a policeman suddenly confronted with the realization that a murder investigation was not going to proceed with the straightforward simplicity he had envisioned. He dispatched a second constable to search the Reverend's study with instructions to recover any correspondence relating to London addresses or suspicious persons, and then turned his attention to the matter of the missing letter, with an expression suggesting he had just realized that police work involved considerably more complexity than he had assumed during his initial training. Wimsey, meanwhile, had begun a rather leisurely examination of the vestry itself, moving with the apparent aimlessness of a man of considerable leisure, though his eyes missed nothing. Neither the scratches upon the vestry lock, recent, suggesting forced entry, or possibly recent oiling, nor the faint dust disturbance upon the small table where the envelope had rested, nor the peculiar arrangement of bottles in the church's pharmaceutical cabinet, which contained the usual ecclesiastical supplies of communion wine, medicinal brandy, and assorted liniments. One bottle, however, a small glass vial containing what appeared to be solution of potassium permanganate, had been moved recently, its base leaving a clear mark upon the dusty shelf. "Tell me, Miss Blackwood," Wimsey said, turning from his examination with the casual air of a man making conversation rather than conducting an interrogation. "Did your brother ever suffer from digestive ailments? I note the church maintains a rather extensive pharmacological collection. Curious for a small country parish, wouldn't you say? Unless, of course, the Reverend was a man prone to self-medication." Miss Blackwood's response came with admirable promptness, as though she had anticipated precisely this question. The Reverend suffered terribly from gastric disturbance, particularly after consuming his usual breakfast fare. He took a digestive tonic each morning, a compound prepared by the chemist in Ashford. Margaret would ensure it was administered regularly. She was most attentive to his dietary requirements. This information, innocent as it appeared, carried within it the sort of significance that Wimsey had long since learned to recognize: a wife administering regular medication, a sudden death, a missing letter suggesting threat or coercion. The pieces, whilst not yet forming a coherent pattern, were beginning to arrange themselves in a decidedly suggestive manner. Inspector Meredith, however, seemed inclined toward considerably simpler interpretations of events, which was perhaps understandable given his provincial background and limited experience with the varieties of domestic poisoning that characterized the more sophisticated strata of English criminality. "We shall need to examine the stomach contents," Meredith was saying to Dr. Ashford, who had remained in the vestry with the sort of professional obligation that suggested he was determined to extract every possible fee from the situation. "And the digestive tonic as well. If the poison was administered through his morning medication, the chemist in town would be the logical source." Wimsey, however, was already considering the problem from a rather different angle. The digestive tonic, administered faithfully each morning by a devoted wife, was indeed the obvious vector for poisoning, but the very obviousness of it suggested a certain theatrical desperation rather than calculated premeditation. Someone who poisoned a man through his daily medication was either genuinely inexperienced in the art of murder, or deliberately attempting to draw suspicion in a particular direction. Moreover, the timing seemed considerably too convenient. A letter on Thursday, sudden death on Sunday, with only the intervening weekend to contemplate whatever threat or revelation the letter contained. Unless, of course, the letter had merely been a catalyst for action already set in motion, or conversely, a response to threats that had been operating for some considerable time prior. The Reverend's son, Edmund, had appeared in the vestry doorway whilst these thoughts were circulating through Wimsey's mind. The young theological student cut a somewhat pathetic figure, his clerical collar sitting askew upon his neck, his fingers working with renewed nervous energy against the seams of his jacket. He looked, Wimsey thought, like a man who had recently discovered that theology provided considerably fewer answers than he had hoped it might, and that the death of one's father, whilst undoubtedly traumatic, did not necessarily pause the requirement for obtaining one's degree. "Has anyone contacted the police in London?" Edmund asked, his voice carrying the strained quality of someone attempting to maintain composure whilst internally experiencing considerable distress. Father had friends there, colleagues from his earlier ministry. It's possible that someone from that period might have some relevance to this dreadful business. Inspector Meredith assured him that inquiries would be mad, though his expression suggested that such inquiries seemed rather less promising than examining the obvious solution before them. Wimsey, however, seized upon this comment with the intensity of a man who had just been offered a genuinely interesting thread: the Reverend's earlier ministry, a period of life, 37 years past, that had been sufficiently formative or problematic to result in the arrival of threatening correspondence 3 decades after its conclusion. The psychological implications were considerable, suggesting either a grudge of remarkable persistence or a secret sufficiently damaging that its exposure warranted extreme measures. Wimsey excused himself from the vestry on the pretext of requiring fresh air, having spent sufficient time contemplating corpses and police procedure to develop a temporary appetite for oxygen and distance from the inspector's increasingly laborious reasoning processes. The December afternoon had acquired that particular grey luminosity that English winters managed with such depressing consistency, rendering the village of Ashford-in-the-Mere a study in monochromatic desolation. Wimsey emerged from the church into the churchyard, where the gravestones stood in their customary attitudes of resignation, their inscriptions worn smooth by decades of weather and the indifference of the living. He lit a cigarette with deliberate leisure, allowing his mind to organize itself around the emerging facts of the case, whilst his eyes ostensibly traced the names upon the stones. What he observed, however, was considerably more practical: the church's east entrance, accessible from the vestry garden, and notably lacking in any sort of lock mechanism that would prevent entry to someone possessed of even moderate determination. The window beside it, moreover, had been recently forced. The wooden frame bore scratches consistent with a C, crowbar or similar instrument, and the glass, though unbroken, sat slightly loose in its moorings. Someone, then, had entered the church via this route, though whether before or after the Sunday service remained a matter for investigation. Wimsey made a mental note to inquire regarding the exact timing of the Reverend's collapse relative to the sermon's commencement. The vicar's widow had materialized in the churchyard with all the stealth of a woman whose life had recently been rendered considerably more complicated by the inconvenient death of her husband. Margaret Blackwood was a thin, anxious creature, her grey hair pinned in the sort of arrangement that suggested she had given the matter approximately no thought whatsoever, and her eyes possessed that peculiar quality of recent shock mixed with something rather less easily identifiable, a sort of careful calculation, perhaps, or the focused intensity of someone engaged in a delicate balancing act. She wore black gloves, though the morning had been spent in white, which suggested either a change of costume motivated by propriety or a rather more deliberate alteration of appearance calculated to influence observation. "Lord Peter," she said, her voice pitched at precisely that frequency designed to convey both respect and a certain desperate appeal. "I wondered if I might speak with you privately. Inspector Meredith seems determined to focus upon the most obvious explanations, and I fear he is approaching this matter with rather less than appropriate nuance." Wimsey turned. his expression arranged in that particular configuration of sympathetic attention that had proven so effective in extracting confidences from worried women throughout his detective career. "My dear Mrs. Blackwood, I should be delighted to offer whatever assistance my limited faculties might provide. Though I confess that the inspector strikes me a rather capable fellow, despite his somewhat methodical approach to investigation. What particular concerns have prompted you to seek my counsel?" Margaret glanced toward the church, where constables were now visible through the windows, engaged in their systematic examination of the scene. She lowered her voice, though the churchyard remained otherwise empty, save for a rather disinterested Robin observing their conversation from a convenient gravestone. "The letter that arrived on Thursday. I must speak plainly, Lord Peter, though the matter is profoundly embarrassing. My husband did not receive correspondence from London out of innocent causes. There was a woman from his earlier ministry, from before he came to Ashford, before he came to me." She paused, her gloved fingers working with nervous intensity against the fabric of her coat. "I have not mentioned this to the police because I feared what they might conclude, but you, sir, you possess the sort of discretion and understanding that might appreciate the complexities involved. This admission, delivered with the careful articulation of a woman who had rehearsed the confession multiple times in her mind before committing it to speech, opened several intriguing avenues of investigation. The Reverend, it appeared, had harbored romantic attachments prior to his marriage, a revelation hardly shocking, but one that suggested psychological complications considerably more interesting than simple domestic poisoning. Wimsey encouraged Margaret to continue, employing that particular technique of sympathetic silence that most women found irresistible. Her name was Eleanor Hartley. She was the daughter of the previous vicar of St. Edmund's in Whitechapel. This would have been in 1888, when my husband was a young curate there. They were to have married, I believe, but she ran away with a soldier, a man of rather disreputable character. The scandal nearly ruined my husband's prospects at the time. He left London shortly thereafter and eventually came to Ashford, where he remained for these past 3 decades. Margaret's eyes had acquired a peculiar glassiness, suggesting she was observing events from considerable emotional distance. The letter on Thursday mentioned her by name. It contained a single sentence: "Eleanor is dead, and her daughter wishes to speak with you regarding your past obligations." That is all it contained. My husband read it, burned it in the study fireplace, and said nothing to anyone. But he was terrified, Lord Peter, absolutely terrified. This revelation transformed the entire character of the investigation. The Reverend's death, rather than representing a simple case of domestic poisoning motivated by financial gain or marital discord, suddenly appeared to involve considerably more complex emotional and psychological factors. A daughter, presumably Eleanor's daughter, making her the Reverend's former fiancé's child, had arrived in England bearing knowledge of events 37 years buried. Whether such knowledge constituted motive for murder remained an open question, but Wimsey found himself suddenly aware that the most obvious suspect in the case, the devoted wife administering the daily tonic, might be considerably more innocent than initial appearances suggested. The real culprit, it seemed, might well be someone considerably more personally motivated by vengeance or the airing of long-suppressed secrets. Wimsey thanked Mrs. Blackwood for her candor and excused himself, his mind already engaged in the delicate business of determining whether a daughter seeking answers constituted sufficient motivation for patricide against a man she had never previously encountered. Inspector Meredith's constables had, by this point, completed their preliminary search of the Reverend's study and had produced several items of genuine interest, which lay now upon the vestry table in the sort of haphazard arrangement that characterized police procedure when conducted by men more accustomed to recovering stolen bicycles than investigating complex poisonings. There were account books revealing that the Reverend's finances were considerably less straightforward than his outward demeanor might have suggested, substantial deposits appearing at irregular intervals, far exceeding what a country vicar's stipend could reasonably account for. There were also several letters, dating from various points in the past decade, written in an educated hand but unsigned, containing oblique references to arrangements and understandings that required maintenance. But most intriguingly, there were the receipts, purchases from a London chemist dating back 4 months, for quantities of potassium cyanide ostensibly intended for photographic purposes, though the quantities seemed rather excessive for a man who showed no signs of being engaged in the photographic arts. The receipts bore the Reverend's own signature, meticulously preserved and filed away with a sort of attention to documentation that suggested either remarkable carelessness or equally remarkable confidence in his ability to explain away such purchases should they ever be discovered. Wimsey examined these receipts with the concentrated attention they deserved, noting the dates, the quantities, and the particular pharmaceutical supplier in question, a reputable London establishment located in Bloomsbury, readily accessible to anyone with sufficient motivation and London connections. The implications were rather startling, suggesting that the Reverend had been actively engaged in acquiring the very poison that had apparently claimed his life. Whether this represented an extraordinarily attempt at self-murder staged to appear as homicide, or whether someone had anticipated the Reverend's purchasing habits and utilized his own acquisitions against him, remained a matter requiring considerably more investigation. The chemist should be contacted immediately, Wimsey suggested to Inspector Meredith, who had begun to exhibit signs of considerable bewilderment at the emergence of such complicating evidence. Specifically, one must establish whether these receipts represent purchases actually made by the Reverend himself or whether someone was operating under his name and authority. The distinction may seem trivial, but it bears directly upon the question of whether we are investigating murder or a rather more elaborate case of suicide staged as homicide. Before Meredith could respond, Edmund Blackwood had reappeared in the vestry, his clerical collar now even more disheveled than previously, and his expression suggesting he had been engaged in considerable mental struggle of the sort that theological training apparently failed to adequately prepare one for. He carried a leather-bound journal, which he presented to Wimsey with the careful movements of a man handling something potentially explosive. "I found this in Father's desk," Edmund said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought you should see it before I showed it to the police. It contains entries, personal reflections. I've only read portions of it, but I believe it may explain considerably more than any of us have yet understood. The journal, when opened to its most recent entries, revealed a chronicle of psychological deterioration so pronounced that Wimsey found himself reassessing the entire nature of the investigation. The Reverend's handwriting, which had begun in neat ecclesiastical script, had progressively deteriorated into increasingly frantic scrawls, filled with references to Eleanor's judgment, the daughter's questions, and most ominously the burden becoming insufferable. Better to end it cleanly than wait for the exposure to come. The final entry, dated Thursday evening, and written in handwriting so disordered it was barely legible, contained a single line: "She is Eleanor's daughter, and she knows. It ends tomorrow, one way or another." This revelation cast an entirely different complexion upon the matter. The Reverend, rather than being murdered by a vengeful relative seeking retribution for ancient wrongs, appeared instead to have been contemplating his own demise upon receiving news of Eleanor's death and the subsequent appearance of her daughter. Yet the question remained, why purchase poison months in advance if one had not firmly decided upon suicide? And more crucially, if the Reverend had genuinely intended to poison himself, how did one account for the forced church window, the missing letter from the study, and the rather suspicious timing of his death occurring in such public and theatrical fashion during the Sunday service? Inspector Meredith had begun to exhibit signs of genuine confusion, his moustache drooping noticeably as he contemplated the possibility that this entire investigation might involve considerably more psychology than straightforward criminology. He had dispatched a constable to locate Eleanor Hartley's daughter, one Miss Elizabeth Hartley, apparently residing at a modest boarding house in the village itself, with instructions to bring her in for immediate questioning. Wimsey, meanwhile, had begun to pace the vestry in that particular manner that his acquaintances had learned to recognize as indicating the emergence of coherent thought from the chaos of competing facts and implications. "The curious matter," he observed aloud, more to himself than to anyone else, is that suicide and murder are not necessarily mutually exclusive possibilities when one considers the question from a sufficiently creative perspective. What if the Reverend intended his own death, but someone else determined the precise method and timing? What if, in fact, our culprit was not motivated by hatred, but by mercy, or by the desire to spare someone from becoming a murderer themselves? He turned to face Inspector Meredith and Edmund, with an expression that suggested he had just recognized the solution to a puzzle that had been tormenting him. "I believe we have been approaching this matter from rather the wrong direction entirely." Elizabeth Hartley possessed the sort of appearance that suggested considerable suffering had been refined into a kind of austere elegance through years of patient endurance. She was perhaps 30 years of age, with dark hair arranged in the severe style favored by women who had learned early that attractiveness was a liability rather than an asset, and her eyes carried that peculiar intensity of someone who had spent considerable time in contemplation of matters considerably more profound than the ordinary business of daily life. She sat in the vestry with the careful posture of a woman accustomed to sitting in uncomfortable places, her hands folded precisely in her lap, and her expression arranged in a configuration that managed simultaneously to convey both resignation and a certain grim determination. Inspector Meredith had positioned himself across from her with all the formality of a man conducting an official interrogation, though his questions had thus far revealed considerably more about his own limited imagination than about Miss Hartley's potential involvement in the Reverend's demise. "You arrived in Ashford on Thursday last," Meredith was saying, consulting his notes with the air of a man who had only recently learned to write. "You took lodgings at Mrs. Pemberton's boarding house. You sent a letter to the Reverend Blackwood on that same day. Within 3 days, he was dead. I confess, Miss Hartley, that such a concatenation of events appears rather suspicious from an investigative standpoint." Miss Hartley's response came with remarkable composure, suggesting she had anticipated precisely such an accusation and had prepared her defense with considerable care. "I did send the letter, Inspector. I will not deny that. My mother, Eleanor Hartley, died 6 weeks ago in London. She had been ill for some considerable time, and during her final weeks, she spoke frequently of the Reverend, of what he had meant to her, and of what had occurred between them all those years ago. I came to Ashford because she wished me to deliver a message. She wished him to know that she had forgiven him, and that she hoped he had found peace in his subsequent life. That was all. The letter was not threatening. It was, if anything, an attempt at reconciliation. Wimsey, who had been observing Miss Hartley with the concentrated attention of a man examining a particularly intricate tapestry, interjected with the sort of gentle inquiry that had proven so effective in extracting truth from witnesses throughout his detective career. "Yet the message your mother wished you to convey was presumably considerably more complicated than mere forgiveness, was it not? You traveled to Ashford yourself rather than simply posting the letter. You took lodgings for an indeterminate period. These are not the actions of someone merely delivering a message of reconciliation. There is something further, I suspect, something your mother wished you to understand regarding the Reverend and your own history." Elizabeth's carefully maintained composure exhibited the first signs of genuine strain at this observation. She looked away, her fingers tightening imperceptibly in her lap, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had acquired a tremulous quality that suggested she was approaching a threshold she had hoped to avoid crossing. "My mother did not marry the soldier," she said quietly. "That was the story they told, the story that was necessary because respectability required some explanation for her disappearance. But the truth was considerably different. She was pregnant when she left London, pregnant with the Reverend's child. She went to the continent, bore me in a small French village, and spent her entire life supporting us both through the most degrading labor imaginable. She was a seamstress, a governess, a housekeeper, whatever work she could obtain under false pretenses. She was never married. I am, in the strictest legal sense, illegitimate." This revelation hung in the vestry air with the weight of considerable implication. Wimsey found himself reassessing the entire psychological architecture of the case. The Reverend, burdened by the knowledge of his youthful indiscretion, had apparently maintained his silence for 37 years. Eleanor, rather than pursuing claims or publicly exposing his moral failure, had chosen instead the path of private suffering and self-sacrifice. And now, decades later, the daughter had arrived bearing the burden of her mother's unacknowledged love and uncompensated suffering, a living embodiment of the Reverend's greatest sin. "Did you confront him?" Inspector Meredith asked, his moustache bristling with the intensity of his concentration. "Did you demand compensation or acknowledgement of paternity?" "No," Elizabeth said, her voice barely audible. "I did not. I came to Ashford intending only to deliver my mother's message, to allow him to understand that she had lived and died without bitterness. That was what she wanted. But when I arrived and began making inquiries about him, I learned of his prominence in the community, his respected position as vicar, his respectable marriage and children, and I realized that my very existence represented a threat to everything he had constructed. My mother understood this as well. She knew that my presence in his life could only bring him pain and scandal. That is why she asked me to deliver the message rather than appear to him herself. She was protecting him, even in her final illness." Wimsey rose from where he had been standing, his expression suggesting he had just perceived the outlines of a solution considerably more complex and considerably more tragic than simple murder. "Tell me, Miss Hartley," he said with studied casualness, "did you encounter the Reverend at all before his death? Did he know you were in Ashford?" Elizabeth shook her head. "I did not approach him directly. I simply delivered the letter to the church through the post. I had planned to leave Ashford on Monday morning, having accomplished what my mother wished. The Reverend's death on Sunday rendered such departure considerably more complicated from a practical standpoint, though I confess it has spared me the considerable awkwardness of explaining my presence to the police." She paused, then added with a peculiar intensity, "I did not kill him, Lord Peter, but I suspect I may know who did." Inspector Meredith's attention had seized upon this final statement with the intensity of a drowning man grasping at driftwood, his questions tumbling forth in an increasingly disorganized fashion that suggested his professional confidence had been thoroughly eroded by the emergence of so many complicating factors. Wimsey, however, raised a hand with the sort of gentle authority that had proven so effective in managing police investigations throughout his detective career, and inquired of Miss Hartley with considerably more precision regarding precise Ely, which member of the Blackwood household she believed responsible for the Reverend's death. Elizabeth hesitated, her moral calculations visibly occurring behind her carefully composed expression, before responding with the careful articulation of someone aware that her words would likely precipitate consequences she could not fully anticipate. "When I delivered the letter on Thursday evening," she said slowly, "I encountered the Reverend's son leaving the church. Edmund, I believe his name was. He appeared agitated, and I overheard him speaking to himself as he departed. Fragments of conversation, really, but sufficient to suggest considerable distress. He mentioned his father's name, and something about obligations that should have been honored decades ago. I thought little of it at the time, but subsequent reflection suggested that he might have been aware of something regarding his father's past." This revelation prompted a rather dramatic change in Edmund Blackwood's demeanor, the young theological student having remained in the vestry throughout the interrogation of Miss Hartley. His previously anxious fidgeting had transformed into something considerably more rigid, his facial muscles acquiring a peculiar tension that suggested he was engaged in the delicate business of maintaining control over emotions threatening to overwhelm his carefully constructed reserve. He rose from his seat with a jerky, uncoordinated movement that betrayed the depths of his internal turmoil. "I did know," Edmund said, his voice emerging in strangled bursts that barely maintained coherence. "I found Father's journal weeks ago. I had been searching his study for money. I confess I was in considerable debt to a rather unsavory individual in Cambridge, and I hoped to find funds without troubling my father further. Instead, I found the journal, and I read it. All of it. I discovered the truth about Eleanor Hartley, about what had occurred in Whitechapel, about the child born and abandoned. I confronted Father on Thursday afternoon, demanding to understand how he could have lived with such a secret, how he could have allowed a woman to suffer under the burden of his moral failure. He refused to discuss it. He said it was ancient history, that nothing could be served by revisiting the past. He said some debts were simply too terrible to repay. Edmund's voice had acquired an almost ritualistic quality, as though he were reciting a confession he had rehearsed countless times in the privacy of his own consciousness. I was furious with him, not merely for the sin itself, but for his refusal to acknowledge its magnitude, to accept responsibility for the suffering he had caused. I left the church and returned to my lodgings in a state of considerable emotional disturbance. But then I realized what I had to do. Father was genuinely troubled by Miss Hartley's letter. He was terrified of exposure, of scandal, of the destruction of everything he had constructed, and I understood that his fear would lead him inexorably toward the only solution he could imagine, his own death. Wimsey's expression had assumed that particular configuration of intense interest that suggested he was observing the emergence of psychological truth of considerable complexity. "You realized he intended to poison himself," he said quietly, "and you determined to spare him that final act of desperation." "Yes," Edmund acknowledged, his voice dropping to barely audible levels. "I followed him to the church on Sunday morning. I had decided during the previous night that if Father was truly contemplating suicide, I could not allow him to proceed without some attempt at intervention or redemption. I positioned myself near the vestry, intending to confront him before the service commenced. But then I saw him preparing his morning tonic. Margaret had left it in the vestry as always, and I saw in his face such complete and absolute despair that I understood words would be entirely futile. I realized that he was going to poison himself during the sermon, that he had chosen this most public manner of death as his final statement regarding his own unworthiness, and I could not permit him to die knowing that he believed himself fundamentally beyond redemption. Edmund paused, his hands beginning to tremble with visible intensity. The poison was already in the tonic. Father had prepared it himself. I now understand from the chemist's receipts and his journal entries. He intended to consume it immediately before ascending the pulpit, but I took the tonic from where he had left it. I substituted the poison myself, but with considerably greater concentration than Father had apparently possessed. I calculated the dose to ensure rapidity of effect. I wanted him to die quickly, without pain or protracted suffering. I wanted to spare him the agony of continuing to exist under the weight of his own guilt. I wanted— His voice dissolved entirely into anguished silence. Wimsey exchanged a measured glance with Inspector Meredith, whose expression had undergone considerable transformation as he contemplated the profound moral ambiguity of the situation before him. The young man had indeed administered the poison, had indeed caused his father's death. Yet the circumstances suggested motivations considerably more complicated than simple murder. A son attempting to exercise mercy upon a father whose guilt had become psychologically unbearable. Whether such actions constituted murder in the legal sense, or whether they represented something considerably more tragic and considerably more forgivable, remained a matter upon which reasonable individuals might reasonably differ. Wimsey turned his attention toward the windows of the vestry, where the December afternoon had progressed toward the peculiar grey twilight that suggested the day was drawing toward its inevitable conclusion. The constable stationed at the vestry door had begun to shift his weight with increasing nervousness, clearly uncertain whether his duty required him to arrest the young man now confessing to his father's murder, or whether the peculiar moral complexity of the situation warranted some alternative course of action. Inspector Meredith, meanwhile, had resumed his methodical note-taking with the air of a man who recognized that his professional obligations remained unchanged, regardless of the emotional subtleties involved in their execution. Yet before either official could proceed with the mechanics of formal arrest, Wimsey raised his hand once more, his expression arranged in that particular configuration of thoughtful consideration that suggested he perceived complications not yet evident to those less accustomed to examining human behavior through the lens of philosophy rather than mere law. "Before we proceed with the formalities," Wimsey observed, his voice carrying that distinctive quality of detached precision that characterized his more analytical moments, I believe there remain several matters requiring clarification. Specifically, I should like to establish the precise chronology of events on Sunday morning, and in particular the exact nature and timing of Miss Hartley's letter and its contents. For I confess that certain aspects of this narrative, whilst emotionally compelling and psychologically coherent, do not entirely align with the physical evidence as I have observed it. He turned toward Edmund, with an expression suggesting neither accusation nor sympathy, but rather the clinical interest of a man examining a particularly intricate logical problem. You stated that your father had prepared the poison himself within the tonic. Yet the chemist's receipts indicate purchases dating back 4 months. Over such an extended period, why would a man contemplating suicide delay his ultimate act? Surely, if one has decided upon such a course, the psychological burden of postponement would be considerable. Unless, of course, the poison was not originally intended for the purpose you have suggested. Edmund's face had acquired the pallor of someone suddenly confronted with the recognition that his carefully constructed confession contained logical inconsistencies he had failed to anticipate. He began to respond, then fell silent, his expression suggesting internal struggle of considerable magnitude. Elizabeth Hartley, meanwhile, had been observing the young man with an intensity that suggested she possessed knowledge considerably more extensive than she had previously divulged. Wimsey, noting her expression, directed his attention toward her with the sort of gentle inquiry that had proven so effective in extracting reluctant truths throughout his investigative career. "Miss Hartley," he said softly, "I suspect you encountered considerably more than merely Edmund Blackwood on Thursday evening. In fact, I would venture the hypothesis that you encountered him a second time, perhaps near the church on Sunday morning itself, at a moment when he was engaged in preparations he had hoped to conduct in solitude." Elizabeth's carefully maintained composure finally fractured entirely. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I remained in Ashford longer than I initially claimed. I had hoped to observe the Reverend from a distance, to assess whether my mother's message had brought him any measure of peace or comfort. I was in the churchyard on Sunday morning, approaching the east entrance, the one with the forced window, and I encountered Edmund. He was agitated, distressed. He was carrying a small vial, and he was examining it with a sort of intensity that suggested considerable internal conflict. I asked him if he was well. He did not respond directly, but instead began speaking of his father, of guilt and responsibility and the terrible weight of inherited moral failure. I did not understand his meaning at the time. I merely attempted to provide comfort to a young man who appeared to be experiencing genuine psychological distress." Wimsey nodded slowly, his expression suggesting he had just perceived the final piece of the puzzle sliding into place with satisfying precision. "And then what occurred?" he prompted. "He entered the church through the east door," Elizabeth continued, her voice acquiring strength as she progressed toward the narrative's climax. "I followed him, partly out of concern for his well-being, partly out of curiosity regarding the family that had so profoundly influenced my mother's life. I observed him from the vestry alcove as he examined his father's morning tonic. I saw him add something to it, something from the vial he had been carrying. But then Margaret Blackwood appeared, the Reverend's wife. She had come to the vestry to ensure her husband's morning medication was properly prepared. She and Edmund exchanged words, heated words, though I could not hear precisely what was being said. And then Margaret Blackwood took the tonic," Wimsey said quietly, completing the narrative with the sort of certainty that suggested he had deduced the final sequence of events through pure logical necessity rather than external confirmation. She observed her son adding poison to her husband's morning medication. She realized precisely what he intended, and in that moment she made a decision that would alter the course of the morning's events considerably more dramatically than Edmund could have anticipated. Inspector Meredith had begun to articulate questions, but Wimsey gestured him into silence with an almost absent-minded wave of his hand. "If I am not profoundly mistaken," he continued, addressing Edmund directly, "your mother intercepted the poison tonic after you had adulterated it. She possessed considerable knowledge of chemistry herself, did she not?" She had spent her life managing household remedies, medicinal compounds, pharmaceutical preparations of various sorts. She understood poisons rather better than a theological student might reasonably be expected to, and she recognized immediately what her son had done, and more importantly, why he had done it. Edmund's face had acquired an expression of profound resignation, as though some final barrier to complete truthfulness had been breached beyond repair. "Mother took the tonic from me," he said quietly. "She did not attempt to stop me or criticize my intentions. She simply took it, examined the poison I had added, and informed me that if Father was to die this day, it would be at her hand rather than at his, and certainly not through her son's actions. She said that she had spent 37 years managing his psychological and emotional burdens. She said she would not permit him to escape those burdens through suicide, nor would she allow her son to carry the permanent moral stain of patricide. And then she administered the poison herself. The silence that followed Edmund's confession possessed the quality of something almost tangible, a palpable absence that seemed to press against the vestry's cold stone walls with considerable force. Inspector Meredith had ceased his note-taking entirely, his pencil remaining suspended above his notebook in a posture suggesting he had temporarily lost the capacity for purposeful action. The constable at the door had assumed an expression of profound bewilderment, as though the fundamental assumptions underlying his understanding of criminal procedure had been systematically dismantled by the revelation that the victim's wife had apparently murdered her husband out of a combination of maternal protection and spousal intervention. Wimsey, however, had begun to pace the vestry with renewed energy, his expression suggesting that whilst the essential truth of the matter had emerged, several peripheral questions remained requiring resolution before the complete architecture of the crime could be definitively established. "The forced window," Wimsey observed, his voice carrying that particular tone of gentle instruction he employed when guiding others toward logical conclusions they should have reached themselves. "The locked vestry door, the missing letter from the study. All of these details suggested premeditation and external intervention, yet they are, in fact, considerably more easily explained by the hypothesis that Margaret Blackwood, anticipating her husband's psychological deterioration and his likely intention toward self-destruction, had been conducting her own investigation into the precise nature of his distress. She forced entry to his study on an earlier occasion, discovered his correspondence, read his journal, and understood perfectly well the crisis that had precipitated his suicidal ideation. She was, in essence, preparing her own intervention long before Edmund's confession forced the matter into immediate urgency. He turned toward the door and addressed the constable with the sort of casual authority that suggested this particular aspect of the investigation was merely routine procedural clarification. "I believe you will find that the Reverend's study window also exhibits signs of recent disturbance consistent with entry from the exterior. The lock, moreover, has been oiled recently, not to prevent entry, but to permit silent re-entry after Margaret had examined her husband's papers and returned them to their original positions. She was monitoring his mental state with considerable sophistication, attempting to determine the precise moment at which intervention became necessary rather than merely advisable. Margaret Blackwood had been conspicuously absent from the vestry throughout the afternoon's succession of revelations and confessions. She had retreated to her chamber following the initial interrogations, ostensibly too distressed by her husband's death to participate further in police inquiries. Yet Wimsey had observed with considerable interest that her grief, whilst undoubtedly genuine, had been accompanied by a certain quality of resignation that suggested she had anticipated this day's outcome with something approaching philosophical acceptance. He now suggested to Inspector Meredith that Margaret be brought to the vestry, though he accompanied this suggestion with a cautionary note that the woman's mental state appeared to be considerably more fragile than her outward composure might initially suggest. When Margaret Blackwood entered the vestry approximately 10 minutes later, her appearance had undergone a transformation sufficiently dramatic to warrant comment even from Inspector Meredith, whose observational capacities had been thoroughly challenged throughout the afternoon's proceedings. The gray-haired, anxious woman who had initially appeared so devoted to her husband's well-being had been replaced by someone considerably more austere and considerably more profoundly diminished. She moved with the careful deliberation of a woman for whom physical locomotion had become an act of considerable conscious effort, and her eyes possessed that peculiar quality of absolute depletion that suggested the psychological reserves upon which she had been drawing throughout the day had finally become exhausted entirely. "I should prefer not to lie to you, Lord Peter," she said quietly, addressing Wimsey directly rather than acknowledging Inspector Meredith's presence or authority. "You have deduced the essential facts with sufficient accuracy that further evasion would be merely theatrical. Edmund did not administer the poison. I did. But his intentions were transparent to me, and I understood that I could not permit my son to carry such a burden. He is a young man still finding his way in the world, still attempting to recon his theological education with the moral complexities of actual human existence. I could not allow him to bear the permanent psychological consequence of patricide, regardless of the circumstances that motivated such action." She paused, seeming to gather what remained of her psychological resources. "My husband and I married 37 years ago because he was a man of considerable intellectual and spiritual potential, and I believed I could provide the emotional support necessary to permit him to fulfill that potential. What I did not anticipate was that the secret he carried regarding Eleanor Hartley would poison every aspect of our subsequent life together. He lived in constant fear of exposure. He engaged in financial arrangements I did not fully understand at the time, paying money to various individuals who possessed knowledge of his past indiscretion. He was, quite literally, being blackmailed by persons who knew of Eleanor's existence and his apparent abandonment of his moral obligations. For decades, I bore witness to his psychological torment, and I could do nothing to alleviate it because he refused to acknowledge its source or permit discussion of the matter." Margaret's voice had acquired a peculiar quality of detached narrative, as though she were describing events that had occurred to someone else entirely rather than to herself. When Eleanor's letter arrived announcing her death and the existence of her daughter, something fundamentally altered within him. He recognized, I believe, that his moment of opportunity for redemption had passed entirely. The woman whom he had wronged had lived her entire life in obscurity and suffering, and she had died without ever receiving acknowledgement or compensation from him. Her daughter now represented not merely a threat to his reputation, but a living embodiment of his deepest moral failure. He determined to escape through suicide. I could not permit that to occur, so I administered the poison myself in a concentration and manner calculated to ensure his death would be swift and virtually painless. I did not do this out of malice, Lord Peter. I did this out of mercy, mercy toward my husband, and mercy toward my son, and perhaps, if I am entirely honest, mercy toward myself, who could no longer endure the weight of his guilt. The confession hung suspended in the vestry air with all the weight of profound moral complexity, creating a situation whose legal ramifications were precisely as clear and precisely as ambiguous as any scenario Inspector Meredith had encountered in his 2 decades of provincial police work. The woman had confessed to murder. The evidence supported her confession. The motive was demonstrable and psychologically coherent. Yet the circumstances surrounding the crime, the mercy-motivated intervention into her husband's suicidal ideation, the protection of her son from committing an act he would have found psychologically unbearable, the decades of endured suffering that had preceded the final act, created a situation that transcended the ordinary categories of criminal culpability and demanded from those charged with administering justice a consideration of factors considerably more nuanced than the mere fact of her guilt. Wimsey observed Inspector Meredith's expression with considerable interest, noting the precise moment at which professional obligation collided with personal moral confusion, and the conflict between these competing imperatives rendered the policeman's features into a portrait of genuinely complicated uncertainty. "There remains one matter requiring clarification," Wimsey observed, his tone suggesting he was merely raising a minor procedural point rather than introducing a consideration that might fundamentally alter the legal and trajectory of the entire investigation. Specifically, I should like to establish the precise nature of the financial arrangements the Reverend had been maintaining with various individuals who possessed knowledge of his past indiscretion. For I confess that such arrangements suggest the possibility of considerable complexity regarding the question of who possessed motive to ensure his death, and whether such motive extended beyond the confines of his immediate family. This observation prompted Margaret to provide additional context regarding the elaborate web of blackmail and extortion that had characterized her husband's financial life for the preceding 3 decades. Various individuals, a former servant from his Whitechapel ministry, an acquaintance of Eleanor Hartley's who had witnessed their relationship's dissolution, a solicitor's clerk who had encountered documentation regarding the illegitimate child, had maintained intermittent contact with the Reverend, each extracting modest sums of money in exchange for their continued silence regarding his youthful moral failure. The amounts involved were not enormous, but they were consistent, and they represented a constant psychological reminder of his vulnerability to exposure. Most of these individuals had long since ceased their demands, satisfied with the modest annual payments that had accumulated over decades. However, one individual, a man named Crawley, who had been a fellow curate in Whitechapel and who apparently harbored considerable personal animosity toward the Reverend regarding a matter unrelated to Eleanor Hartley, had recently renewed his demands with considerably greater intensity and insistence. Inspector Meredith had begun to exhibit signs of renewed investigative energy upon hearing this information, his professional instincts recognizing that such additional complications might warrant expansion of the investigation's scope beyond the immediate family. Yet Wimsey gestured him into patience with a subtle movement of his hand, and instead directed his attention toward Margaret with an expression suggesting he was approaching a considerably more delicate matter. "You have been remarkably forthright regarding the essential facts of your husband's death," Wimsey observed with studied casualness. "Yet I wonder whether your candor extends to certain peripheral matters. Specifically, I should like to know whether you possessed knowledge of Edmund's intentions before he entered the church on Sunday morning. I should like to know whether you deliberately positioned yourself in the vestry at precisely the moment when he would be adding poison to his father's tonic. And I should very much like to know whether your claim to have prevented him from committing murder is entirely accurate, or whether you had, in fact, anticipated his actions and deliberately ensured that you would be present to intercept him." Margaret's composure exhibited the first genuine signs of fracture upon hearing this suggestion. Her hands, which had remained steady throughout the preceding interrogation, began to tremble with visible intensity. Her eyes acquired a peculiar glassiness, as though she were observing events from considerable emotional distance. When she finally responded, her voice had acquired a quality of such profound weariness that even Inspector Meredith seemed to comprehend that he was listening to the confession of a woman who had exhausted the psychological reserves necessary to maintain further pretense. "I did know," she said quietly. "Edmund's distress had been evident to me for days after he discovered his father's journal. I recognized the trajectory toward which his emotions were progressing. I understood that he would eventually determine some form of intervention was necessary. I did not prevent him from obtaining the poison. I encouraged him to do so. I ensured that he believed himself to be acting with autonomy and agency in pursuing a course of action that represented his own moral choice. But I positioned myself to intercept him at the crucial moment, ensuring that I would be present to prevent him from completing the act. Or so I told myself. The truth, Lord Peter, is considerably more complicated. I was prepared either to permit him to poison his father or to poison the Reverend myself, depending upon which course seemed at the moment less damaging to my son's psychological well-being. In the end, I made the decision that I could not permit Edmund to carry such a burden, so I intervened. Whether that intervention represents an act of mercy or an act of calculated manipulation remains, I suspect, a matter upon which reasonable individuals might reasonably differ. Inspector Meredith had acquired the expression of a man whose fundamental assumptions regarding the nature of criminal investigation had been systematically dismantled by the emergence of psychological and moral complexities that formal police training had conspicuously failed to address. He looked toward Wimsey with something approximating desperation, his moustache drooping noticeably as he contemplated the question of how one properly charges a woman with murder when the victim had apparently been contemplating suicide, when her son had been prepared to commit patricide out of twisted filial devotion, and when the entire sequence of events had been orchestrated with such careful psychological calculation that distinguishing deliberate murder from intervention in an ongoing family tragedy became an exercise in philosophical rather than legal reasoning. Wimsey, perceiving this confusion with the sympathetic clarity of one accustomed to leaving police officers in pressure, such states of bewildered paralysis, rose from his position with the deliberate movements of a man preparing to deliver pronouncements of considerable significance. The matter before us, he observed with that particular tone of detached precision that characterized his more analytical moments, is not truly one of establishing guilt or innocence in the conventional legal sense, for both have been amply demonstrated. Rather, it is a matter of determining whether justice demands the prosecution of a woman who has committed an act that is simultaneously murder and mercy, intervention and autonomy violation, protection and manipulation. The law, I fear, provides considerably less guidance on such matters than philosophy might suggest it should. He turned toward Margaret with an expression that combined neither sympathy nor condemnation, but rather the clinical assessment of a man observing human behavior in its most complicated manifestations. You have murdered your husband, Mrs. Blackwood. This fact is established beyond reasonable doubt. Yet the circumstances surrounding that murder suggest that we are dealing with something rather more psychologically intricate than ordinary homicide. The question that now demands resolution is whether the machinery of criminal justice can appropriately address such complexity, or whether it must necessarily reduce the matter to its most simplified components and thereby fundamentally misrepresent the truth of what has occurred. Wimsey moved toward the vestry window, his gaze tracing the darkening landscape beyond as the December afternoon progressed inexorably toward evening. Your husband was a man destroyed by guilt. Guilt regarding a youthful indiscretion whose consequences he had spent 37 years attempting to suppress through a combination of silence, financial compensation, and professional prominence. The let, announcing Eleanor Hartley's death and the existence of her daughter, represented not merely a threat to his reputation, but a final confrontation with the reality that his victim had lived and died without ever receiving acknowledgement or redemption from him. He had decided upon suicide as his final escape from this unbearable knowledge. Your son, discovering his father's journal and understanding the depths of his moral crisis, determined to spare him the psychological agony of continued existence by administering poison himself. Both men were proceeding toward the same destination through different routes, one seeking escape through death, the other attempting to provide mercy through intervention into that escape. And you, Mrs. Blackwood, recognize that you could not permit either outcome to occur without profound psychological damage to yourself and your family. He turned back toward those assembled in the vestry, his expression suggesting he had arrived at conclusions of considerable moral weight. Yet in determining to prevent your son from committing murder, you committed it yourself. You were not motivated by malice or financial gain, or the ordinary passions that typically drive such acts. You were motivated by what you believed to be mercy, and by your determination to protect your son from bearing the permanent psychological consequences of patricide. Whether such motivations constitute adequate justification for taking a human life remains, I suspect, a matter upon which both theologians and legal scholars would find themselves in considerable disagreement. The law provides no category for merciful murder. The law provides no mechanism for acknowledging that sometimes the most profound acts of love and protection necessarily involve the violation of its most fundamental prohibitions. Elizabeth Hartley had observed this pronouncement with an expression sue. Jesting, she was arriving at recognitions of her own, regarding the complex moral architecture of the situation in which she had inadvertently become a principal agent. She rose from her seat and addressed the assembly with a clarity and purpose that seemed to surprise everyone present, including herself. My mother spent her entire life in service to a man who abandoned her without acknowledgement or compensation, Elizabeth said quietly. She bore his child in obscurity and suffered the permanent social consequences of that birth. Yet in her final illness, she sought not revenge against him, but rather reconciliation and the communication of forgiveness. She believed that her suffering had purpose, that it might lead to transformation and redemption. The Reverend has died without receiving the opportunity to hear her message of forgiveness. That opportunity has been forever lost. But I wonder whether my presence here, and my knowledge of the circumstances surrounding his death, might serve as some form of partial redemption for the family that has been so profoundly damaged by his original act of abandonment. She turned toward Margaret with an expression of profound compassion. I do not believe you should be prosecuted for your husband's death. I do not believe that such prosecution would serve any meaningful purpose regarding justice or truth. I believe instead that you should be permitted to continue your life with the knowledge that you acted out of love, even though that love expressed itself through an act that the law would characterize as murder. I am prepared to testify to the police regarding the emotional and psychological circumstances that preceded the Reverend's death. I am prepared to assert that the man was actively contemplating suicide, that your intervention, whatever its legal characterization, prevented a tragedy that would have been considerably more psychologically devastating to your son and your family. Inspector Meredith looked toward Wimsey with an expression suggesting he was awaiting guidance regarding whether such testimony would be admissible or relevant to his official investigation. Wimsey nodded slowly, his expression suggesting that he perceived in Elizabeth's offer a pathway through the moral and legal complexity that had threatened to paralyze rational judgment. Sometimes he seemed to indicate through that single gesture justice required not the prosecution of the guilty, but the recognition that certain acts of love and protection transcended the ordinary categories of criminal culpability. Margaret Blackwood would likely face charges. Whether those charges would result in conviction remained, as these matters often did, a function of factors considerably more complicated than mere guilt or innocence.